It has been 1 year since the premiere of House of the Dragon Season 2, and I've needed just about that long to collect my thoughts on this season of television as a whole. It's a truly bizarre season. If you ask George R. R. Martin who his favorite historical Targaryen is, he will say Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, because he's made of light and dark in equal parts. He is the greatest of heroes and the darkest of villains, and the fact that he is both is what makes him such an appealing character to George Martin. I guess George wrote him. That would also probably make him appealing, but I digress. I view House of the Dragon Season 2 in kind of the same way. It has some excellent adaptation decisions and some terrible adaptation decisions, and a lot of elements that go wrong with the season aren't necessarily the season's fault. Today, I'm going to examine the highs, the lows, the shortcomings, the strengths, and I hope you will join me for that ride. Let's start with some of the good. Season 2, Episode 2, Rhaenyra the Cruel, is a top 10 or top 5 Game of Thrones episode for me, full stop. It is incredibly acted, incredibly written, and it does a great job adapting a bunch of events from the books in the most interesting way possible. I have an entire video devoted to specifically that episode and why I love it so much. And I think this season overall very much has an arc of quality that is a little front heavy, in that the first half of the season is definitely a good bit better, or at least more consistent than the latter half of the season. The latter half of the season, in and of itself, is not bad. We'll get to that in a minute, but it definitely has more failings and it ends on a bit more of a downer note than some of the highs that preceded it. It is worth noting that this season only had 8 episodes. Season 1 had 10, average seasons, good seasons of Game of Thrones all had 10, and then 2 not good seasons of Game of Thrones had 10, and then they started dropping off. But regardless of that, this is an interesting point because it is not the fault of the House of the Dragon creators. HBO, in their eternal greed, cut 2 episodes from the season after the season had already been written. And to make matters worse, the writer's strike was ongoing at that point. I fully support the writer's strike, and I'm glad they got what they wanted and it's over now. But that meant they could not rewrite scripts on the fly. They were effectively locked into the first 8 episodes of this 10 episode season that they had previously planned, which is very unfortunate, as if you look at the ending of the season, it's not really an ending of the season. They tried to make it as kind of climactic as possible and build up the epic music going over the montage of the troops marching, but it's not an ending by any means. I think that'll be a lot better once we actually have a season 3 to go with it, but being left on that note for over 2 years probably is going to be quite the bitter pill to swallow. I should also note, I think the marketing team specifically ruined the final scene like 50 times more than the bad it already was, as all of these shots of troops marching have already been used in pretty much every trailer for this season the entire time we've been seeing them. So we knew these shots were going to be there at some point, and ending the season on them, it just really feels like kind of a false promise, as the thought is, oh, we're seeing in the trailer these shots of the troops marching. We're going to see these troops do something this season. But no, we are ending on these shots of the troops marching that we've already seen before. It's just really frustrating. That was my biggest point of pain coming out of the final episode, save for one thing that I'll address later. But I think it's very anticlimactic, though the music in that scene is fully incredible and might be my favorite composition Giovanni has ever done. Flipping back to something I quite like, I think the dialogue is really well done this season. I could see people not liking it as much, but I think it is the closest to George R. R. Martin's like words in his books that we've actually seen on screen. There are so many little turns of phrase that are so common in the books that we haven't heard on screen before, but they are so common this season. Little and less, much and more, canny schemes, words are wind. It's just a lot of fun, and it's really neat to see these adaptations actually taking the care to adapt the words of the book, though there are other areas in which care was not taken in adaptation. Of course, we need to address the George R. R. Martin shaped elephant in the room, that being the Beware the Butterflies post. For those who are not aware of it, George R. R. Martin made a post on his blog criticizing season 2 heavily. Not only decisions they made, specifically cutting Maelor, who is one of the children of Aegon and Helena Targaryen, who was the person who survives the incident with blood and cheese rather than Jaehaera in the books. But that criticism even goes further to criticize choices that the show really hasn't made yet in reference to things that happened with Helena and her fate. And it is a very interesting read. And it did get taken down by George Martin within a couple hours of being posted. I have a video on that post that was recorded while it was still up, so it's an interesting little time capsule. But it is very unprecedented, as Martin really hasn't publicly criticized Game of Thrones all that much, and he does seem to have taken that turn with House of the Dragon, which is bizarre because House of the Dragon seems to be a lot more respectful as an adaptation. There are changes made and things that I'm sure Martin would disagree with, but in terms of actually having love for the source material, it seems like they actually do, as there's a lot more focus on not only the supernatural elements that David and Dan very much steered away from, but these little linguistic elements that I talked about before, and just very thematic parallels between things like A Feast for Crows and the themes about war in this season. Martin's butterfly post was also intended to be a series, which you can tell from the language of the post itself, which makes me wonder what elements of the show he was going to criticize even further. I have some guesses on that front, the main one being cutting nettles. For those of you who don't know, the dragon that Rhaena sees at the very end of episode 8 is Sheepstealer, this dragon who's claimed by a girl named Nettles in the books. She has no known Targaryen or Valyrian heritage, and she is a very interesting case, as she just feeds sheep to this dragon until it likes her enough to let her ride it. She's a really interesting character, one of my favorite characters from the books, and she was seemingly cut in this season of the show. Martin seems to not like this change, as he did a long blog post back in July when the season was about halfway through, talking about dragons and their habits and what really makes them realistic in his series. In this instance, he talks about them not being nomadic, and I think that very much is a criticism of, oh, why is sheep stealer here in the Vale and not on Dragonstone? So I think that there was a Nettles post in the pipeline that we will never see because I think HBO got to him thinking that he spoiled something from season 3. I want to interrupt myself and ask, what are your opinions on season 2 of House of the Dragon? I'd love to hear them in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I really appreciate it. I've been a little negative. Let's talk about the elements of the season I like for a second. I really like a lot of the changes they make from the book. I think there are some areas of focus that really aren't touched on in Fire and Blood that really get some interesting depth added in this season of House of the Dragon. I have a couple to specifically talk about, the first of which yields my favorite scene of the season, that being the relationship between Larys Strong, and Aegon Targaryen. This is a very important relationship for both of these characters. It is in the book, but it really isn't developed in the book. Here, we see Larys begin to kind of work Aegon in the first half of the season, manipulate him using what he knows, and Aegon being a little dumb. But then we see Aegon grievously wounded at the Battle of Rook's Rest. And from there, we see his relationship with Larys take on a new depth that I think neither character really expected it to have. I did an entire video on how George Martin writes about disability in his books, and I think that this is the best example of a show picking up that torch, as Larys's speech to Aegon is tremendously moving, not only to me, who is personally affected by these things, but I imagine to wider audiences as well. It looks as though Larys doesn't even want to be sympathizing with Aegon. He didn't expect to be sympathizing with Aegon, but he can't help but see a similar situation to his own and want to give the best advice that he can. It creates this genuine bond between these two characters that I am really excited to see explored in the future of the series. Another thing that I quite like in this season is the focus on the small folk of King's Landing and the Seven Kingdoms as a whole. That's an element of Martin's work that is often overlooked. While all of our viewpoint characters are generally these noble-born, prestigious individuals, we get a lot of focus in the books on the common man and what's going on there through Jaime's perspective, through Arya's perspective. We get to see the struggles of the people of Westeros who are not from these noble families. And I think this season does a great job carrying that torch as well. We got a lot of focus on Hugh and Ulf, who are obviously people who need development to fill their arcs from the books. But from there, we get to see elements of King's Landing life fleshed out as well. Additionally, another character that I see a lot of criticism of in season 2 is Mysaria, the White Worm. And honestly, I quite like her role in season 2. I think she's set up to have a very compelling dynamic with Rhaenyra. We'll get to Rhaenyra in a second here, but I think Rhaenyra takes a bit of a turn in the last 2 episodes, getting kind of culty and thinking that she is the dragon, sacrificing a bunch of commoners to dragons to try to get one to claim one. It's a really interesting direction for the character. And I think that very much sets up a point of pain between her and Missaria, as Missaria is all about protecting the common people. And I think Rhaenyra might not keep that in mind as much as Missaria might like in season 3. And I think it'll create a pretty interesting dynamic. I do think Missaria was a bit weaker in season 1. Specifically, the accent work was pretty strange. And additionally, I think she makes a weird decision giving Aegon to Otto in episode 9. But I really like her arc in season 2, and I think she's a pretty consistent character, and I don't really see what people are complaining about. With Massaria set to take a seat on the Black Council in season 3, let's talk about the two councils we have on this show and the strengths and weaknesses of each. I think the Black Council is far weaker overall, and the scenes tend to be quite repetitive with the dynamic between Rhaenyra and her counselors. But I think the reason for that is not that there aren't interesting characters on Rhaenyra's side, it's just that these interesting characters, after like episode 3, aren't present at council meetings, which really sucks because the interesting part of council meetings is seeing all of these different characters bounce off of one another. I want to see Jace, Corlys, Rhaenys, Baela, Rhaena, all of these people on Rhaenyra's side who have interesting connections to one another and interesting opinions on the war, talk about what's going on, rather than seeing Bartimos Celtigar talk for 3 episodes straight. I don't really think it's a great summation of Rhaenyra's side. I think that is why Rhaenyra's side maybe gets less praise in terms of parts of the season that people liked. The Green Council is more consistently interesting. I think they've done a better job characterizing each individual, and I think Allison acts as a great window into this council for the audience through the episodes where she is on it, as she is very much one of the more logical people in the room, as is Otto, but Otto has a lot less time on that council. We see the Green Council kind of fall away over the season as they're either dismissed or sent elsewhere, or in Otto's case, kidnapped. But I do think that it maintains some degree of being interesting, as even with these counselors falling away, it is interesting to see the power consolidated in Aemond as regent. There are also certain characters who I felt were entirely sidelined for no good reason whatsoever. Corlys is one of the biggest examples of that. He is, I would say, in my top 3 characters of season 1, and he just feels like he has nothing to do here, which he really shouldn't. He is locked to the docks for the entire season, but we really should have spent more time with him, especially in his grief for his wife's death, as him and Rhaenys have been this pair that have always been together since the very first episode, since the first scene of the first episode. They've been in lockstep on nearly everything, though they had some disagreements during season 1, but they seem to come through that even stronger. It would have been really interesting to explore these things more in depth, but they just don't focus on Corlys for some reason. I do also really like Alan and Adam of Hull. They're a very good dynamic with each other and with Corlys. I just wish we'd seen more of them. I think that's an issue of having so few episodes. I'm excited to see where their arcs go in the future. I really like Aemond this season, but I can't help but feel I could have used a little bit more of him or from him. We get one good scene where he's kind of reflecting on his recent past. I do regret that business with Luke, I believe he says, and that is a super interesting facet of the character. We can see on his face that he clearly didn't want this to happen, both in this scene with Sylvie and when the event actually took place, and that is a very interesting way to kind of interpret the character. There's that quote from season 1 of The Sopranos that's Tony sees on the wall, what, a man cannot wear one face to the masses and one face to himself without becoming bewildered as to which is true. That was off the dome. Don't think it's correct, but I think that could have been really interesting to examine as an arc for Aemon, with this kind of facade of being this callous, cruel individual and maybe being more damaged on the inside. I think that I really would have liked to see that explored, but I felt like this season just didn't have time for it. Aegon, on the other hand, was very, very fun to watch. Obviously a terrible person, but it is fascinating to see this person who is not really a great ruler get kind of stripped down to just being his mind. As Laris says, it's not a great mind, but it's going to be all he has going forward, and it will be interesting to see how he comes through these injuries and changes as a person and a ruler. I think that he has one of the more interesting arcs set up for season 3. Going from the king to the queen, Rhaenyra has a pretty good arc this season. I think they've adapted her pretty well. I think there is some slight character assassination in the final episode, though I might be overusing the term character assassination, as she seems to forget about Helena as a potential combatant, and she then advocates for burning down Lannisport and Old Town, which is kind of strange and kind of out of line with her prior characterization. I did mention that she does seem to take a little bit of a turn in episode 7 with kind of this idea that yes, she's the blood of the dragon and she's ordered all of these people to die on her behalf. It is interesting. It is a way to kind of change the look on her character and I think tie into her general focus on this prophecy as the reason for her needing to be in power, in addition to her being the rightful claimant as named by Viserys the first Targaryen. I almost said Viserys the second. That's not him. But I do think Rhaenyra's arc is pretty compelling this season in the later half. The first half, she really doesn't do much except ask, "What would you have me do?" to her council, and then go secretly meet Alicent. Oh, speaking of secretly meeting Alicent, I think the number of secret meetings very much diminished the weight of the secret meetings, as it felt like someone very much should have gotten clipped at one of these, as these are very powerful enemy combatants who are sneaking behind enemy lines with effectively no consequences. If it happens once, sure, that's believable, it makes sense, they have a lot of power, they have a lot of resources, they can do what they want. But having Daemon sneak into King's Landing, and then Rhaenyra sneak into King's Landing, and then Alicent sneak out to uh I almost said Castle Rock, Dragonstone, and then having people sneak into King's Landing to start the riots from Rhaenyra's side. It's just a lot of back and forth, and I think that it could have maybe been handled better. And I think that Alicent as a whole is also something that could have been handled a little bit better. Alicent's arc is a complex one to discuss because I think it's really good if you ignore the last episode. This idea of Alicent losing agency and power at court as the war begins makes a ton of sense and very much falls into line with what is going on for the character in the book as well. It makes sense that she would want to get away from all of this chaos and cruelty that has damaged her and her family so much. But I don't think that she would go so far as to want to sell out her children to be executed. We saw how she reacted to Aemon losing an eye in episode 7, and despite Aegon being a monster and Alicent knowing that, I don't think she would willingly allow him to be executed. I think that maybe there could have been a gray area where Rhaenyra might have taken advantage of it. I don't think that it was really necessary to have this be the final solution that she comes to in this conversation with Rhaenyra. I think she'll have an interesting dynamic with Rhaenyra going forward, but overall, I think this last episode, episode 8, was very much a failing with the characterization of Alicent because I really don't think she would sell her children out like that. I also think that Alicent maybe gets a few too many scenes this season. I think her arc is excellent, but overall, she's a character who is not super necessary to this phase of the war. I think that time could have been better spent with other characters, like maybe introducing Daeron or seeing more of what Rhaena and Baela or Corlys are doing. Daemon Targaryen is quite the interesting character to discuss in reference to season 2. His arc was one of the more controversial, especially among the more general audiences, as he spends 6 of 8 episodes tripping at Harrenhal. These visions that he has are quite interesting and are a great way to not only explore the character, but to allow him to grow as a character. But I have 2 very large issues with this arc. First and foremost, I think it is a little much. I think that we could pretty easily cut at least one episode's worth of Daemon's visions and get to his conclusion a little bit faster, or otherwise just not have him in an episode and give more time to other plots. Additionally, his final vision going through the Weirwood and seeing the future, the White Walkers that look terrible, Daenerys Targaryen, all of this. I don't super like that. I like the idea that there are connections to the main series in terms of this prophecy and what's going on with the motivation of some of these characters, but having such a direct tie just feels really weird to me. I think placing this vision where it was placed really does it no favors, as I think it completely disrupts Daemon's arc. Daemon had been going on this journey for the entire season to come to the point where he is going to embrace Rhaenyra as a ruler and truly support support her over his own claim. He gets there on his own through these personal visions he's having at Harrenhal, but then the last vision he has is, oh, this big great destiny thing, the Song of Ice and Fire, all of this prophecy, and that completely supplants his personal motivations in a way that I really dislike. I think it very much substitutes the grand plot for the character, and I think that that is something that Martin very much doesn't like and doesn't do in his stories. I also wanted to discuss the quality of these episodes in relation to one another in ranking format, since everyone loves that. I'm going to do a reverse order of most YouTube rankings, starting with my favorite and going to my least favorite, because I've already made it very clear that my number one, my favorite, is Rhaenyra the Cruel, which is like a top 5 Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon episode for me. Honestly, it might be top 3. I would need to think on that further. But after that, I would say a tie between the Red Sowing and the Red Dragon and the Gold. Both of these episodes are based on pretty iconic events from Fire and Blood. I think they did a great job adapting both of them as they come across very, very well on screen. After them, at fourth place, I would probably put the Burning Mill. I think it's a very underrated episode. People very much clown on it for its ending, but I think that is one secret meeting that I was okay with. I think that that should have been the only secret meeting in this season, but I digress. I love the images of the circle and the cycles of violence that are started by the Brackens and the Blackwoods, and I think it's just a pretty good episode overall. Following that, I would say the first episode comes in fifth place. A Son for a Son is pretty good. It does have some flaws. I don't like that we didn't see much of Jace and Cregan in Winterfell, or any of them at Winterfell. They're just at the Wall, which is kind of strange and kind of weird, but it's okay. I'm not worried about it. And also, I think Blood and Cheese has some issues, particularly being from their perspective rather than from the perspective of the individuals that are the actual victims of it. After that, in sixth place is episode 6, Small Folk. I think it's a fairly basic title, but it is a pretty decent episode. It kind of spins its wheels a tiny bit, but besides that, I think that there are very much good elements here, like my favorite scene in the season between Larys and Aegon, though it did get review bombed by homophobes. Following that, I think that the season finale, The Queen Whoever Was, despite having the dumbest title I've ever heard, is not a terrible episode. I like parts of it. I think the music is excellent. I think it is a decent episode, if a terrible finale. And following that, I think the worst episode of the series so far is episode 5, Regent, because I feel like nothing happens. It's just kind of spinning its wheels, and it feels like they really didn't get a chance to rewrite that script. Like I've said, season 2 of House of the Dragon is a bizarre season of television, but I do still think it is more good than it is bad. I've seen people say, oh, this is worse than late game Game of Thrones, and that is absolutely not true whatsoever. Late game Game of Thrones made no sense and didn't stick to the books whatsoever, and while there are significant divergences from Fire and Blood in House of the Dragon, I am a little bit more okay with most of those divergences. Things like Cutting Nettles make no sense, and I fully hate it, but Fire and Blood, as it stands, is a history book, and one that is written to be deliberately ambiguous, as opposed to A Song of Ice and Fire, which is a novel from our viewpoint's perspective, and while they can be biased narrators at points, generally what they see is fact and what should be adapted. There's a lot of room for interpretation in the events of Fire and Blood, and I think that Ryan Condal has done just that in a lot of instances. Cutting characters doesn't make a ton of sense in terms of actually making that adaptation, but beyond that, I think a lot of the changes are generally okay. And I think a lot of what's wrong with this season does come from HBO rather than the creators of House of the Dragon. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and it does really help grow the channel. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on Season 2 of House of the Dragon, and when we see Season 3 in 50 years' time, I'm excited to share my thoughts on that too. I'll have many videos on A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, Dunk and Egg, Game of Thrones for you in the very near future, so I hope you'll join me for all of those. Goodbye, everyone.